housekeeping details attended to. I would like to acknowledge the OCLC Research Library Partnership, which both underwrites and inspires our work. Attendees of this webinar are from the OCLC RLP. Thank you for your continued support and input into our work. These are crucial to our success. And now I'm delighted to turn things over to my colleague, Shayla Weber.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. Good morning from the West Coast of the United States. I'm Shayla Scott Weber. I'm a Senior Program Officer here at OCLC for the Research Library Partnership, where I focus on research and programming that supports work in archives, special and distinctive collections. So we have a number of folks on the registration list today who I don't think regularly attend our webinars and may not be very familiar with the RLP. So I want to take just a minute to share what we're all about. The Research Library Partnership is a program of OCLC and is a membership organization. So if you're here today in this live webinar, your library is a member and you are a partner in the partnership. And as Mercy already sort of talked about, we're a unique international collective of peer institutions and colleagues. And together with my fellow program officers, we work hard to create opportunities and spaces for members of the partnership to work together to address common issues facing research libraries through programming like this webinar today, discussion groups, working groups, and research efforts. Our email lists are the best way to find out about this programming. So if you aren't already to subscribe to one of our lists, go ahead and sign yourself up if you'd like to, and we'll drop a link into the chat. There's primary sources, which is our list specifically about archives and special collections work, and then announce is our general list where you can hear about all our programming. So OCLC Research and the Research Library Partnership have a long history of work in the area of archive, special and distinctive collections and research libraries. And we work in special collections because we understand that in the research library context, they are an important site of knowledge creation that is made possible by the library's commitment to the stewardship of those collections. And we also understand that the challenges brought about by the unique nature of material and special collections. And so we work to identify areas of common need and complicated challenge and build programming that helps libraries scale up their learning and expertise with these collections. And so today we're here to contend with one of these truly complicated but vitally important challenges and share learning across the partnership. Diversity, equity, and inclusion has been an important area of focus for research libraries for a number of years now. But over the last year and a half, there has been an increased sense of urgency for many to confront and attempt to dismantle systemic racism. Confronted by the murders of Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and too many others, and inspired by the organizing of the Black Lives Matter movement, many research libraries put out statements affirming their support for the value of Black lives, condemning white supremacy, and committing themselves to confront racism and bring about systemic change in their own institutions. And while important, statements such as this are largely symbolic if we don't move past mere statements to figuring out what material support and concrete action is needed, and to find the practical and tangible increments of work that can move us toward our anti-racist intentions and aspirations. Today, we welcome Dorothy Berry, Digital Collections Program Manager at Harvard's Houghton Library. Throughout her career, Dorothy has advocated for expanding access to archival materials documenting African American history. And a significant and impactful part of that work has been generously sharing her perspective and experience and expertise with the broader profession. And so I'm really pleased that Dorothy agreed to join us today to share some lessons learned from leading Houghton's year of pausing on ongoing digitization projects to focus all resources on increasing access to African American history materials. I hope that each of you will find something tangible and practical to take back to your own institutions in service of moving from statements to action. And with that, I'll turn it over to Dorothy.
Great, thank you so much, Shayla and Mercy, and thank you everyone else for joining me today. I'm really excited to share a true work in progress, the Slavery, Abolition, Emancipation, and Freedom Primary Sources from Houghton Library project. And I'll acknowledge at the outset that this is a title that looks very nice in print, but is somewhat ungainly to say, and we often just call it SAFE, and I will be doing that throughout the presentation. The structure for today's talk might feel a little roundabout, but hopefully follows our own local process, which was much at the whims of the unpredictability of the last year, as anything else in our work and personal lives. I'm going to start with some background on the project, including contextualizing the work within the larger digital collections goals at our library. I'll then get into the planning process and some of the on-the-fly changes that had to be made, along with the desired outcomes, deliverables, and unexpected developments. I will end with a summary of the lessons learned thus far and acknowledgements for the many friends and colleagues who contributed to the progress thus far. I was brought on about 3 years ago as Houghton's inaugural Digital Collections Program Manager, with the goal of developing a transparent and programmatic model for curating our digital collections. While we historically had a fairly healthy digitization schedule, we weren't working programmatically enough to build collections. Piecemeal digitization of single pages, partial collections. There was also a goal of developing more equitable digital projects, both in terms of the content and in terms of, and in terms of who was allowed to submit possible projects. There was also a situation where without central funding, digital collections building had been largely shaped by curatorial endowments, which were largely focused on promoting the Western canon. A new digital project submission process was developed in a sort of internal micro-grant model with open submission form and rotating review panel of stakeholders from across Houghton, as well as from Harvard Library's large university serving imaging services department. While this process was successful in opening up the proposals beyond our curatorial division, it didn't meet our goals of diversifying the material we digitize. I began creating a list of undigitized African American history materials in our collections and planning for a proposal of my own when the pandemic shut down our workflows and changed the conversation completely. In the summer of 2020, with almost all staff working remotely, I began to receive requests from across the library for digital images of African American people, history, books, anything, as universities responded to the nationwide conversations on race that Shayla alluded to. Due to this aforementioned spotty digitization history, I had very little to offer these colleagues and decided we needed a major move to address this for the future, while acknowledging the past practices that got us to this point. I wrote up a single-page proposal for Houghton's senior management team, asking that we pause all of our digital projects for the FY21 fiscal year and dedicate our digital collection resources entirely to digitizing material relating to African American history and culture. That list I'd been building, which at the time had about 500 items listed, came in handy. The full pause was both symbolic and practical, representing both a responsibility for work we had historically ignored as a library and recognizing the practical limits of taking on a large-scale project in a pandemic without bringing on any new staff in a department of one when it comes to digital collections. The senior management team responded positively, but requested the project be expanded to include a cross-departmental team and educational component. Though this required developing new project features beyond simple digital access, it was welcomed as both a way to expand our remote project management experiences. Like many libraries, we had no codified remote processes before the pandemic, and to increase the number of staff with knowledge and understanding of our Black history holdings. At this point, we were at early July 2020. Staff had not yet begun to return to work from Houghton, but colleagues in imaging services were back in action preparing e-reserves for newly remote classes. The SAFE project's initial development was coeval with the development of scan-on-demand workflow for patrons needing access to reference scans, which meant that I, along with 3 other colleagues, would be returning to on-site work at the end of that month. My project team members, our assistant curator for modern books and manuscripts, our digital archivist, and a reference librarian, would all remain remote for the next year. Working within these parameters, the initial project plan was fairly simple: developing an easy lift educational program for the team to go through remotely, working with imaging services to deliver and digitize materials that I identified and pulled on site, and create new access points for the digitized materials through our catalogs, finding aids, and a data set that would be downloadable via a collections page using Harvard's Spotlight instance, which is called Curiosity. The first lesson learned from this project at the very beginning was the value of planning for unexpected opportunities to make bold proposals. I knew from my initial days at Houghton that we needed to find ways to highlight our African American history holdings, and so had ideas and inventory in mind long before circumstances aligned in a manner that made this project possible. Keeping track of ideas, possibilities, dream projects allowed me to jump on the chance to make what I hope is a lasting contribution. While I had the project idea fomenting for quite some time, seizing opportunity meant a more detailed project development would have to happen on the fly. By inviting colleagues with professional affinity for either the materials and/or for diversity, equity, and inclusion work, I knew I had a group that would put in as much effort and energy as they could. Before our first official meeting, I set up a Google Drive for the project and created detailed documentation, including possible tasks for self-directed work, a full list of the material identified, a time tracking timesheet, project description, and educational readings, and meeting notes. I also set up a Teams channel for the project members and encouraged them to be conversational and not afraid to ask questions. While we had Teams and Slack available before the remote turn, they were not, as a library, something we were particularly active users on, especially when it came to project management. Creating all of this background documentation was time-consuming, but working with a spirit of flexibility meant being willing to throw out what initially seemed like good ideas. A couple of months in, I realized that my colleagues were struggling to use the time tracking sheet, and then had to reflect on why it existed in the first place. In our next team meeting, we discussed the issue and pivoted away from tracking time and towards just adding a message to the chat to update team members. For example, I'm working on this tab in this spreadsheet. I've got about 20 rows to go. I think I'm going to have to move on to this in an hour. On-the-fly project planning meant for me finding the balance of conflicting motives and realities. One of the first was finding balance between trying to run the remote project with a small team as requested by senior management, and the desire of colleagues from across the libraries to feel like they had enough access to our information and work. I wanted to be protective of the team who are asked to take on new work during a traumatic period, but also did not want to make this seem like a opaque special project. Our compromise was to keep all of the aforementioned working documents private, but to create a public sheet that listed all of the initial items and included a tab for colleagues to suggest items we hadn't seen. This information was also available in Aeon under a project, but that can be a more complicated tool, and we wanted something straightforward. The second, and most unexpected for me, conflict was between what we had pulled from the catalog and what I found on the shelves when I was finally able to return to the office in late July. Call numbers with a single item in our catalog were revealed to be pamphlets with 15 to 25 uncatalogued items bound with. This required another on-the-fly development, fitting in well to the demand for remote cataloging projects. I would come on site for time-limited shifts and take hundreds of photos, cover, title page, back of title page, last page, of pamphlets, upload them to a shared folder, and add a transcribed title to a listing, and pass them on to a cataloger colleague, who I think has actually joined us today. Our system is set up so that we cannot digitize items without a catalog record. And even with the records, there were questions of condition, possible disbinding, and conservation that we hadn't planned for. That second conflict is an element that would become a major feature in the biggest planning problem of the whole project. The library had publicly agreed to let me focus departmental resources for a full fiscal year, but that was a year like none other of our professional lives. Schedules were limited for safety reasons. Faculty requests for newly remote classes took priority, meaning there were many months of the year where no work could be done on the project by colleagues at Imaging Services. And of course, we were all dealing with various personal and familial difficulties. These unexpected, and some expected to be fair, challenges taught me the second major lesson of this project. Make flexibility your strength and emotionally detach from your own expectations. It's difficult when you've made a bold move to not put a lot of weight on its success, but owning your flexibility with transparency is a success of its own. In spite of various hurdles, after a year of identifying, cataloging, digitizing, and logging materials, we are weeks out from launching our digital collection site. In the meantime, we've already accomplished the digitization of over 1,000 items, including entire archival collections around topics like the domestic slave trade and the Freedmen's Bureau. We've cataloged over 200 previously undiscoverable publications and manuscripts. And we've made a great deal of progress in updating archival description for both accuracy and biased language, including use of outdated language in our domestic slavery collections and details such as our various Harriet Tubman letters that did not include any notes in the finding aid, that those were written by someone else's hand. The primary goal of the project has always been to increase access and discoverability, and so we have been working on ways to put the materials in front of researchers who may be approaching our collections from various different angles and access points. Every digital object is linked to either a catalog record or a finding aid, depending on its type. It's available through Harvard's digital library and will soon be available via our Curiosity site. As mentioned earlier, the data set will also be made available via the site. We've been trying to make our workflows and processes as accessible as the content itself, and have been posting documentation publicly to the Houghton Technical Services Wiki, which will become much more updated when the project is complete and we can look backwards. The lesson learned here was to not be ashamed of promising exactly what you can deliver. Throughout the project, people have shared ideas for expansion, new directions, cross-library collaborations, many of which were really thoughtful and fantastic. Realizing that we had a limited timeline and that a lot of the labor was falling on my position individually, I realized our most successful option would be to promise exactly what we could deliver. No customized design site, no enhanced fancy features, but 100-fold increases in access to Black history at Houghton. Now, throw everything I just said out the window. I'm kidding, of course, but there was actually an option for project expansion that we did take advantage of, primarily because this option came with the necessary funding and time release possibilities. In late fall of 2020, Harvard Libraries announced an open competition for internal grants aimed at advancing open knowledge and improving access and representation of marginalized people's material. At this point, I went back to some of those thoughtful ideas that had been parking lotted and focused on two big discovery and access themes. What can others do better than we can? And how can we support advanced research on this digital corpus? One of the first things we recognized others could do better was creating interpretive text for the digital collections page. I had on my long list of tasks writing up an introduction to the collection and some sorts of loose historical contextualizations, but I have neither the time nor background to do anything much more than that. We seized this funding opportunity as a chance to provide a platform for emerging scholars and to invite Harvard students into Houghton as collaborators. We hired 5 different students from a larger applicant pool to write essays on 5 themes: Black voices, abolitionists, the early republic, the antebellum, and the Reconstruction. We met with students virtually and provided them with a basic writing guide and a template to input their content, but generally advised them to not worry about being comprehensive or encyclopedic, and to focus on aspects of their theme that they were the most appealing to them. The only hard requirements we gave them were to use digital primary sources from the project in their text, and to provide 5 recommended further readings and 5 related digital objects at the end of their essays. The work these young scholars submitted is wonderful in its diversity of voice and thematically pulls in areas none of our staff could have accomplished. The abolitionist theme focuses heavily on visual arts in the service of abolition, and the early republic theme pulls heavily on Paul Cuffey to bring in Black and Indigenous relationships in the early republic. Another key "what can others do better" opportunity came about because of the combination of local Houghton Library preliminary discussion of wanting to provide services for middle and high school students, and a local Boston colleague inviting me to a panel on Boston Public Schools' Black Studies curriculum, on which she had been an educational consultant. Knowing her background in special collections and education, I discussed the project with her and was able to use grant funding to support the development of a middle grade educational unit focusing on restorative justice and personal relation to the complex histories in these digital objects. My colleague provided a foundational research around the demographics for Cambridge and Boston area students and worked with us to identify appropriate primary sources to fit her lessons, which will be available in full on the digital collections site. This felt incredibly important to us, not only as a tool to increase Houghton's reach, but an acknowledgement both of the increasing need for remote learning guides as schooling and education is still in a state of flux, as well as a need to truly meet the stated goals of being open and advancing access through digitization beyond just people who already may feel they have access to our collections. Perhaps the biggest benefit of the grant funding was the chance to work with colleagues in research data management and digital scholarship to use this collection in service of developing new workflows to make not only our, but also future digital collections much more accessible to users. I'm highly simplifying both of the following initiatives, both in deference to time and to my own lack of expertise, though I'm glad to share contact information and some of the further more detailed documentation on either. But first, we developed a workflow to get digital object packages into medium-term storage, and then into Dataverse, a repository for research data. With our current systems, it is not possible for patrons or staff, really, to pull large amounts of data from our digital repository. But we knew that from the outset that access to that data could open the door to really unique computational research across this corpus. My colleague in digital scholarship also used this opportunity to pilot some machine learning-based OCR workflows, which are documented in a GitHub that I'm glad to share out when it's ready, and will be available, linked out on the collection site as well. But they piloted some machine learning-based OCR workflows to get at least partial transcripts from the many handwritten materials in the collection. This enhanced access not only opens up the collection to fresh research, but is providing use cases for products that will benefit projects across Harvard Library. The lesson learned here is to keep a wish list in your back pocket, though that might seem to conflict with the earlier lesson. This lesson for me is closely paired with promising what you can deliver. I spent much of this project focusing on not asking for more resources to prove that we can still do great things with reallocation and not need to spend years searching for new allocation, and telling people that this sounds like a great project, but maybe for someone else. Keeping track of those possibilities and not single-mindedly pushing ahead, however, made us able to do much more than we initially set out to do. I'm so glad you could all be in attendance today and listen to what I hope was a useful overview of this work in progress. I know that each of our institutions have different priorities and resources available, and hope that at least some portions of our project resonate. There are probably other lessons to take away from this project, and undoubtedly other lessons I will realize when it's completed. But my 4 takeaways from now are to take opportunity to reallocate boldly, being willing to make dramatic pivots with the support of planning and preparation, making flexibility your strength, be willing to let go of ideas at the speed of dysfunction and move on to something new. Don't be ashamed of promising exactly what you can deliver, being willing to deny requests that sound great but are out of reach, but also keeping a wish list in your back pocket, keeping track of things that are out of reach so you can be ready when opportunity comes. I want to acknowledge my many, many colleagues who assisted and are still assisting in making this project what I hope will be a success. At Houghton Library, Christine Jacobson, Micah Hogart, Monique Lazier were the project team. Meg McNiff did that pamphlet cataloging project. Vernica Downey assisted with a lot of the metadata work. She's our metadata librarian. And my manager, Susan Pazinski, both was a great sounding board and also was protective of our time on the project. At Harvard Libraries overall, I want to thank those colleagues in digital scholarship, research data management, and imaging services. I want to thank our student scholars and Mecca Aponte, the educational consultant. And I also want to thank some of, which certainly there are far more, of our colleagues outside of Harvard who supported this project through promotions, through suggestions of material, and through just general positive support. Thank you for attending, and I'm excited to share questions and comments with you all.
Thank you, Dorothy. Folks, please go ahead and enter any questions you have into chat. We'll be reading them out of chat, and then Dorothy will be answering. And while you get warmed up and get some questions into chat, I have a few of my own, so that we can start with. Dorothy, I'm curious about the shift in priorities that the project called for, and if that was sort of culturally a challenge, and what support you think is necessary to sort of hold tight to a shift in priority like that.
Sure. So we had about 14 ongoing digitization projects on paper material, excluding AV, at the time that we had this project began. And they were all fantastic projects. This is something I always say about Houghton. It sounds like it's towing the company line, but it's also somewhat objective, is that none of the projects that were ongoing were not very important to research purposes and very engaging. We were doing Trotsky's correspondence, Emily Dickinson Library, Family Library, other things of that nature that are inarguably very relevant to research. But with that many ongoing projects, there just wouldn't be the time. And I think that the negotiation was partially supported because Tom Hyrie, who was at the time just head of library, but now is our AUL for special collections, was on board with the project and handled any sorts of conversations with the curatorial division who were needing to put their work on pause for this. I think that we were also, it's strange to say it this way, but we were also served by the knowledge that this would be a less productive year writ large because of the limited times on site and all of these other complications. So that was, in a sense, a compromise that was accepted by people whose work needed to go on pause because their work would not have been continuing at the same pace or the same level of progress regardless.
Great, thank you. And then sort of as a follow-up to that, your year has come or is about to come to a close. I don't know exactly when your year started, but you're at the end of your year. and I'm wondering, and a year is great, that it's wonderful that they were willing to do that reallocation. But what do you think is important to carry forward from this so that you don't, you certainly didn't I imagine you didn't find and digitize everything in the collections that you could have. How were there any lessons learned about sort of shifting priorities moving forward?
Yes, I think one of the biggest lessons learned on that was a way of, and this is somewhat relevant specifically to Houghton Library, but I actually do think is something that could be taken to various collections, which is rethinking what the collection's strengths are through focus. I would say, and I heard multiple times before when I got here in my earlier days that although they were beginning to do this work of diversifying collections, Houghton did not have a strong African American collections. And that was not because that was not an area that we had done particularly strong focus on collecting. And through this work of actually taking the time to look in our shelves and our holdings and see some things that maybe we didn't even know about with all these uncatalogued items, but even things that just weren't prioritized as our top items, when put together, we have very strong African American holdings. And specifically, we have strong holdings in 19th century print. And I think that that sort of idea has also allowed opening up of conversation of what are other areas that we might have really key materials in if we were to refocus on what is important or what is valuable. And I think that that is a huge benefit. I think also there's some practicalities of even just the amount of time I spent in the stacks looking without looking in the catalog and realizing, oh, we have this whole range is actually really strong on a certain topic related that's maybe outside the scope of the project, but that would be really great for us to be highlighting. And that sort of work has opened up ideas of potential future projects that are not necessarily only on African American history, but like this pamphlet cataloging project of what other bays have lots of uncatalogued material that could really benefit from getting even just stub records and really changing the face of what are Houghton's library, what are Houghton's collections.
Yeah, that's great. That's actually really insightful takeaway. Thanks. Okay, I've got a couple of questions from the chat here, and folks, please feel free to continue to put questions into chat and make sure that it's set to send to everyone. Otherwise, I won't be able to see them. So from Marilee, she asks, is the call for internal funding for advancing open knowledge available externally, just so that others can view it and read it? And was that a library initiative or campus-wide?
So that was a library initiative. Advancing open knowledge was is sort of, I think, the title of our larger strategic planning goals. So it's a wide, very broad theme. For some reason, the link to the actual grant description page isn't working right now, but I'm going to put in the chat the announcement of all the other really fantastic things that were funded. And it should be, I mean, I'm not sure why that link is down. And I'm going to try a little bit to find the link where that information lives. But it was publicly posted, and I do think it's a good example of a type of internal funding opportunity that, okay, I found the right link. A type of internal funding opportunity that is really opening up sort of these sorts of smaller projects or adding on to work that's already happening.
Thank you. And another question that's come in, I've been building an anti-racist and social justice collection in print. This collection has a rotating display element that we are intending to track. Is there a way that you would be able to track the impact and use of the collection you presented today? And have you set parameters on what success looks like when it comes to use?
Sure. So the digital collection site that will be up in November is hosted on Curiosity, which is our Spotlight instance, and that does have full like not algorithms, I'm sorry, I can't think of the term right now, but that has all of the data of use, which is beneficial.
Analytics.
And then we also have same use data from the Dataverse collection. For me, success is something that, especially with large collections, like, you know, over 1,000 items, I don't have particular tracking, and luckily I'm not asked to, of something like each item needs X number of hits for us to say that we've reached our goals for use. I think that inviting students, I think for me, a lot of the success has already happened because a lot of the things that we did as this project are not things our library has traditionally done, but that we can do now. We have this good example of how it was functional or some process. So for example, bringing those students in is not something we usually do. And especially ranging from undergraduates to postdocs and letting them have authority over their language in the presentation, in the presentation of their thoughts. And putting that on the website equal to the language that's coming from library staff is not something we have usually done in something that isn't part of a class project. But their work was amazing and we are really pleased with it. And that's the sort of thing we want to be doing. So a lot of that stuff like that and like the educational unit for middle grade students are the type of work that just even having done the process of creating it feels like a success for me.
Thanks, Dorothy. Okay, here's another question. Could you talk about the relationship with other online collections within the African American focus?
Sure. So let's think of different ways. One is that when I was sourcing these materials, I pulled heavily from like Kansas State's Black Book project, tracing Black publications, and sort of cross-checked that with our own catalogs. And then when things that, anything on that list that we had within the time range we were going from, that was on that list was added to our inventory of things we wanted to digitize. So a lot of bibliographic and digital humanities work that focused on bibliography, we pulled, I used to help source our inventory. The same is true of some collaborations with the Colored Conventions Project, talking with them who are on the Acknowledgements with Jim Casey and Gabriel Foreman, helped us expand sort of the search for things that would be Colored Conventions related materials. Also, everything that gets uploaded to the Curiosity site will then be harvestable by DPLA, which should mean that they are harvestable for Research African American History aggregator at University of Minnesota. So hopefully there is a great deal of use that way. And I also hope that we're able to promote, to do targeted outreach and promote this with faculty that do Black digital humanities work or that are teaching on some of the topics that are really heavy here, because I experienced personally in some rare book school classes this summer that professors were referencing materials that they didn't have a digital copy of. And I knew that we had just digitized this because of what our particular strengths were. And being able to support those classes as a student made me realize that a lot of targeted outreach would have a real benefit.
Great. And so another question here. I love the idea of creating opportunities for students to take the lead on interpretive aspects of the project. Can you talk about how you evaluated those applications and then selected the students?
Yes. And I'm going to pull this up so I can actually know what I'm referencing. So we sent out an announcement that my colleague Christine made very well designed. And then my colleague Christine, who is the assistant curator for modern books and manuscripts at Houghton and who is on our project team, I made a review document, and I'm going to try to find it so I can know what yes. A review document that traced sort of qualitative and quantitative responses to the student submissions. So the students submitted a writing sample and then a brief sort of cover letter. I didn't want them to have to do CVs or anything like that because it shouldn't be that formal. And so the spreadsheet I made, like many archivists, so many spreadsheets. So on the spreadsheet, there were a listing for the student's email, their name, their status at Harvard, their areas of interest, and then a very qualitative 1 through 5 ranking on the quality of their writing from both me and Christine, and then any notes on them. And then we both had a column for accept and or decline, and then we met and discussed that. So we were, in a great embarrassment of riches sort of scenario where we got very good, all the applications were really good. So a lot of it was just sort of, maybe this writing is not as smooth for this particular type of topic or for public history, or this student doesn't really express having a background in African American history compared to some of these other students and their strengths. But we wanted to try to make it, it's things like this. Fairness is not necessarily the best way to approach it, but I wanted it to at least be really clear how we were making these decisions.
Thanks, Dorothy. And another question about working with the students from Kelly Boulding. I love how you found ways to engage student experts in this project. I'm curious whether you ever considered employing students to work with archivists or catalogers to make updates and revisions to catalog records or finding aids directly. Do you have thoughts or hesitations about that kind of model?
So I didn't consider that particular model for this project because until I think this summer, we were not allowed to hire students because there was a freeze. So we weren't really allowed to do any outside sort of hiring work anyway, which is another one of those little things that came up that we wasn't necessarily expected or wasn't maybe as helpful as other things could have been. But I'm not against hiring students to do this type of work if it fits in with their study and it's actually a benefit to them. I am a strong believer that student work needs to be of educational benefit to students in this type of context, even though it is work and they're getting paid for it. But it wasn't even an option at this point because we weren't even allowed to hire anyone because it was a freeze until fairly recently. And even then it was, this was not necessarily the highest priority for hiring with all the other things that we had backlogs on. My only hesitation would be that we would want to make sure that the students were comfortable with the material because a lot of the material that needs fixing or needed correcting was potentially emotionally effective, with a lot of the material around the domestic slave trade. And the catalog records, we probably wouldn't have done as student because a lot of those would needed someone with actual cataloging experience because they were not done at all.
Thanks, Dorothy. And a question from Jessica. Jessica, I'm not going to say your last name because I'll probably mispronounce it. There seem to be ongoing and intensifying issue with the understanding of what it means to develop collections that bring forth previously underrepresented topics, people, and communities. In the current climate of anti-critical race theory, have you experienced any pushback about this collection and/or an expectation that the so-called opposing views be represented in a collection as well?
So for the first portion about pushback, I don't really think I think maybe some people on Twitter weren't happy because they said, this isn't fair. What about collections that aren't about Black people? But then my response is, luckily, Houghton has been focusing on them for the entire time Houghton has been doing digitization. So if that's your argument for fairness, then that is fair for us. That's fine. But we didn't get a ton of that, partially because of Houghton's collecting. This is not primarily Black authored material. A lot of it is material about Black people. A lot of it is abolitionist material that is speaking for Black rights, but I think out of, how much would that be? Trying to do percentages. Maybe a third is written by Black people, and then a lot of it is about. And some of the abouts, there's various levels of closeness, I would say. So some of that is we have Thomas Higginson's papers when he was a commander of the Black volunteer unit in Port Royal. And so that is all about Black servicemen, and a lot of that's very close, and some of it's very separate, pamphlets arguing about slavery. And I would say in terms of the so-called opposing views, we actually do include that. It's a very curated list of material, as Jayla was saying, or whoever, she was maybe reading some of the questions. There's a lot more material that did not get included just because of time, and we have so much content. But there are some pro-slavery arguments that were digitized. There's very few actually sort of racist material, I don't know how that would be phrased, but racist material, a lot of it's contextualized. So for example, we have a racist broadside from Boston from 1822 that's in satirical dialect announcing a celebration for the abolition of slavery, which was a thing that was done yearly from the African Society of Boston, from the international slave trade abolition. And we have both this racist broadside, and we have from that exact same year an actual program from that event as it was run by the African Society of Boston. So we think that that's useful as a comparison. Or for example, we have two of the pamphlets that popularized the idea of miscegenation. So that was racial mixing and the term miscegenation were popularized through two propaganda pamphlets that were written as if they were from pro-Black rights people, but were secretly written by people that were pro-slavery and wanted to be fearmongers. And those are really important historical documents. So yes, we've included those as well. So I think yeah, I'm a little less concerned about that.
Great. And another question here from Dana Peterman. Do you anticipate projects using source material that aren't in English? And if so, could you talk about that?
Yeah, so this collection does have material that's not in English. We have a large collection about Cuban slavery that was digitized as part of this project. Initially, I had said African American because I wanted to narrow my scope, but then there was a heavy demand. And as I talked to the educational consultant later on, I was pleased that we had somewhat met that demand because the demographics locally that are very heavily Black or very heavily Black from the Caribbean. So the material is relevant. And that material is in Spanish. Its finding aid is in Spanish and English. So the access there is not something I'm super concerned about. And we have a couple of items that are sort of one-off items that are one is in German, and it's a publication of a pamphlet that was about Black military service that was reprinted in German for German immigrants in America. And then we also have a copy of Gronasaw's slavery narrative that was published in Wales, so that's in Welsh. And both of those were OCR'd, and they're I don't know how well that worked. But yeah, so there are other languages represented in this collection itself.
Thanks, Dorothy. Another question from the audience is your initial proposal for this project available?
Let me see. I don't think that the initial proposal is the single page proposal is available, partially because it had some internal to Houghton things in it. The initial project proposal that was more widespread, so that went beyond just the senior management team, is available on Houghton's technical services wiki, which I can find a link to and put in the chat right now.
Thank you. I have a question about sort of if folks are thinking about doing a similar project in their own institutions. You mentioned thinking about what you might assign students and the emotional impact of working with materials around slavery, and this has been an incredibly difficult almost 2 years now. How did you sort of support folks working on this project through the kind of the emotional work that was involved?
Sure. I tried to make it very clear from the outset that folks should feel no discomfort in saying I can't work on this, or in taking breaks, or saying I started to work on this and I'm going to stop. And I tried to demonstrate that as much as I could in our sort of shared chat group or Teams channel with the project team, of saying, because one of the things in our data set was there's a field for person names, like from Dublin Core. And in our slavery collections, in the finding aids, because of archival description, most of those say the name of the slave trader and his business associates, but the documents themselves list the name of the enslaved. And I wanted to have those names represented in our data set, which meant transcribing lists and lists of names from these bills of sale, which was incredibly harrowing. And I myself would say in the chat sometimes like, oh, I'm getting started on this. And so when we were fully remote, sometimes even, I'm going to start on this at like 2. This is what I'm going to do for the rest of the day, which might mean I'm done working at 3 and I'll have to start again late, you know. And I think just trying to mirror, not mirror, but represent a vulnerability or just a recognition of humanity is very important with this. And I think with students, I would be even more careful on that and would want to not have it be up to them necessarily to only state their discomfort, but want to be more proactive as well.
Great, thank you. Let's see here. So Jessica, just responding to your answer to her question, said about pushback, said she's responded in similar ways about her ASJ collection. We have an extensive collection spanning 100 plus years and leaves out or minimizes the history that I'm trying to highlight. I'm glad that you have not felt pushback of any importance. And another question from Claudia Friedel. Thank you so much for this. I have been working on advocacy for initiatives and projects to dismantle the systemic oppression within the collections and all access and discovery points. Do you have any highlights or thoughts on discussion points to advocate for student involvement in interpretation for administration?
Sure. One of the things that was really important to me was sort of representing the reality of the situation, which is that, especially when we're talking about graduate students, but I'll say our undergraduate was one of our best writers, they know more about these topics than I do, because that is what they are doing their research on currently. They are experts far more than anyone on staff. And so there is a logical benefit of wanting to bring in experts. You know, another benefit is that this is providing a service, talking administration thinking, this is providing a training service that helps keep our special collections relevant, because the students, we presented this as an experience gaining writing public history for web content. And that's something that it was very interesting to them. And even one of the students asked me to write a letter of recommendation for her for a Rhodes Scholarship, because this was an example of her doing public history work and working with special collections. And that's, these are strengths we can offer that we haven't traditionally thought about the type of experiences we offer students. But I think everybody in special collections is realizing that we're definitely not in a time when we need to be proving ourselves less. So I think that that's also a strength. And then just sort of, one of my thoughts was, of course, there are multiple books written on almost every single topic within this collection. And sometimes there's multiple books written about a single item in the collection. So there's no way we were going to be encyclopedic in the content we can provide. And so purposely moving away from that and saying, here are 5 student essays on these themes represented in the collection, felt almost more factual than trying to have me write 5 essays about these huge topics.
Thank you, Dorothy. I don't see any new questions in the chat, and we're almost at the top of the hour, and I know lots of folks probably have another meeting to jump to, so I think we'll go ahead and call that the end of Q&A. Thank you all so much for being here, and Dorothy, thank you especially for coming and sharing your knowledge and your experience with us today. We really appreciate it. Folks, I'm going to drop in chat again the link to our email lists. If you enjoyed today's programming and you want to join us again, please sign up for a list so that you can do this again with us in the future.
Great. Thank you, Chela. And of course, Dorothy, thank you so much for, I think, sharing so many insights, lessons learned, so much for us to think about and consider implementing and acting on. So I'm really happy to have some things to think about, some real steps, some concrete steps we can all take. So thanks again to our attendees for being here today, for conversing with us and having this lovely, engaging conversation. We will post a recording of this webinar online, along with resource links, along with a transcript of Dorothy's presentation, and we'll notify you by email when that recording is available. This concludes today's webinar. Thank you, and have a great rest of your day.